What is Blender? Blender is an open source 3D modeling program capable of doing almost anything needed in 3D modeling, animation, and more. Now that I've explained that, we can get into Blender. Okay, now that we're in Blender, I should probably explain the basics in the UI. At the top of your screen, you have this bar, and up here you have your files, which lets you import, export, make new files, and open stuff. Edit, which is your preferences and settings. Render, which lets you render stuff. This, which window tab, which lets you customize your windows and your layout. And then some help stuff, which is pretty useful. Then up here you have your layout, which is your main workspace that you're going to be modeling with. You have your modeling layout, or like a workspace, which is used for modeling, but usually you just use layout. There's sculpting, which lets you sculpt on it and manipulate the cube. You have UV editing, which is really important as it lets you unwrap the object and basically lay it out flat here so that you can then add textures to it. If you do that, you can then texture paint on the object to paint directly onto it. The shading tab is really complicated, so it's probably best to put this in its whole other tutorial since it's super complicated. Then there's the animation tab, which shows you a rendered view and an unrendered view, and it lets you animate your object here. And then there's a sheet here called the dope sheet, and basically it shows your keyframes and how you're animating. It's really useful. There's a rendering window, which lets you show what you're rendering. Then there's the composing window, which lets you change and edit the images you have, which is really useful. There's geometry nodes, which is really, really, really complicated and really hard, so it's really hard to use. I have no clue how to use. It's really useful though. It lets you automate and basically code with nodes to create geometry and meshes and stuff. And then there's the scripting tab, which lets you code and make programs for Blender, which is really, really cool. Over on the left side of your window, you have your tools. And we're currently in object mode up here. In object mode, you can select an object, you can move it around, you can rotate it, and you can change its scale. You can also there's also a tool that lets you do all these things at once. There's a tool that lets you draw and annotate and basically draw in the 3D scene, which is pretty cool. There's also a tool that allows you to measure the angles and the sides of things, which is really, really useful. And a tool which lets you create squares, and it snaps onto faces, like so. Now that we're in edit mode, you can see that we now have the ability to see vertices, these little dots right here. Basically what a vertex is it's a little dot that basically has a position in the X, Y, and Z coordinates. It doesn't have any volume or shape of its own, but it's basically just shown as a dot here. Then you can see that they're connected to each other with these edges. And when these edges come together and all meet and connect together, it makes a face. And the face is kind of like the mesh that kind of is shown. And basically these are really, really useful and really important. You'll see that on the left side of our screen, we now have a bunch of new tools on the toolbar as well. You may have noticed this earlier. But we basically have these new tools that allow us to do a lot more, along with keeping the original tools. One of the most important ones is probably the extrude tool, which allows you to extrude either vertices out and basically create another one in where you moved it. You can also move out and extrude edges, which extrudes out an edge and basically creates another one and ends up creating a face along with it. Then, if you go into face mode, which is up here, and you select the faces, you can extrude, and it creates basically another box on top of it, and basically creates new geometry. This tool is really, really useful in 3D modeling, and is probably one of the main tools you might end up using. It's really, really useful and lets you do a lot of stuff. Down here we have the Inset Faces tool. This tool allows you to basically make another face inside of where you had the other face. This is really useful as it lets you create basically a smaller box sitting on top of another box really easily. And this is a super useful tool that you'll also be using a lot with hard surface and other types of modeling. There's then the bevel tool, which allows you to smooth out and make edges less sharp, like up here, for example. And this is also really useful. You'll use this a lot in hard surface, which is basically when you model a kind of like rough, like kind of like surface with hard edges instead of organic stuff like people or animals. Then you have loop cut tool, which basically lets you cut a loop around it, and these add new vertices and new geometry that you can play with. Like before, you wouldn't be able to pull these out, but now you can. It also adds a bunch of new like faces and other stuff to the thing that allows you to do more. There's also the draw, or like knife tool. Basically, this one lets you manually draw out the cuts. And with this, you can basically cut out the geometry you want, and basically draw the geometry that you want to appear. This is really useful. It's also really good for doing manual topology, which is basically where you get like your vertices and everything to be working well together. So that way there's like usually you want like 4 or 3 of them on a face like this. So this is decent topology. But you also don't want something called an n-gon, which is where you have more than that amount. Like here, you have 5, and this is an n-gon, and it's basically not any, like, it's like not really a good shape. You don't want this. It's really bad. Okay, so now these tools, which I've never seen anyone ever use, you don't really need to use them or know about them. You can look those up yourself if you want. You've got the polybuild, the spin tool, which is actually really useful, the smooth tool, the edge slice, the shrink slash flatten, the shear, and the rip region. Okay, so the spin tool is actually really useful. What this allows you to do is it allows you to basically spin a like face around and create like a ring or something else with it. And this is really, really useful because you can also put on other axes, like this one. You can like reduce or increase steps, and you can also do a bunch more with this. And this is really, really good for doing stuff like pipes and other things. It's really, really useful. In this tab, called the Scene Properties tab, it allows you to customize certain features, like the measuring system used, simulation mechanics, like what the gravity and other stuff is, audio, and multiple other things. Beneath that is the World Properties menu, which allows you to control things like the background of your render and your thing, your project, such as the color, the strength of it, like how bright it is, volume, and mist, like settings, like the resolution of the lighting and and if there's shadows, and multiple other things. In the collection menu, you can customize the collection and what it's doing, like that you can disable it so that the objects inside of it don't appear in renders, and more. In the object menu, this allows you to take the object you currently have selected and be able to move it around, like so. It also allows you to rotate and scale, and allows you to do a lot more stuff way more precisely in Blender. This is the modifiers tab, which we'll come back to later, but it's basically a way to use a non-destructive workflow to apply certain things, like subdividing, which basically smooths out your object, and more. This is a really useful menu, and you're probably going to use it a lot. Then we have the particle menu, which allows you to create particle simulations, like using emitters to create particles with gravity or other mechanics. And hair simulations allows you to simulate hair. Like you can see that when I applied it, a bunch of hair came off of it. Next up, we have the simulation menu, or the physics menu. And basically, it allows you to apply things like collision, rigid bodies, and soft body simulations to your models, so that way you can simulate them and how they behave. In the constraints menu, you can apply certain things that allow you to control how it interacts and how it moves. This is really useful in rigging and basically creating a model and like allowing it to move, because you can basically say how much you want to move, if other stuff should move with it, and more. The data menu shows different groups of vertices. So like if I have these vertices here, I could put them in a group. And I could assign them, and then I could do stuff with these, like being able to select them or deselect them. Next up, after that, we have shape keys in here, which is another useful animation tool, where you can take two different versions. You can make these two different shape keys, and if you select them, you can change the way one of them looks. And then you can change the value, and it will tween between them. This is really useful in rigging and modeling, along with animation, and you might use this too. You then have the shader menu, which allows you to assign materials and change their color. It also allows you to do other stuff like how metallic it is, how rough it is, and its index of refraction, basically how much it reflects. Finally is a texture menu, which allows you to take textures and create stuff, and then putting in different noise or other things. This is sometimes used when using a displacement modifier, because you can then assign a texture to it, and it will displace it in that way. Okay, now that we're done showing all this stuff, if you go back to the modifiers menu, and you go to these different modifiers, these are things that basically change how your object behaves, and basically are part of a non-destructive workflow, which basically means that it's a workflow that's like doesn't change permanently how your object is and like what it's shaped like. Using the tools is part of a destructive workflow, which is basically where you like actually change how the object permanently will look. So in here, I can like assign the subdivision surface modifier, which I showed you earlier. With this, you can basically add and basically smooths out and tries to make everything look like a circle, but like different geometry makes it look more like the base object. So like if I had loop cuts here, here, and here, you can see that it looks more square now. And if I add stuff here, I can make it sharp on that side. So this also still smooths it out a bit, but it's really, really useful. And this is really good for organic modeling and sometimes hard surface modeling too. Okay. Next up is the mirror modifier, which is another modifier that, unlike the subdivision surface modifier, basically creates a second version of your object. And if you do this, you could delete this side, like half of your object, if it was symmetrical. And basically, if you delete these vertices, you can basically make it so that your object looks like you can see here. There's two of those on both sides. Like if I delete the faces here, like so, you can see the faces are still there, but this time they aren't really there, and it's basically just another modifier. But if I move this side, you can see it also changes too. This is really useful with symmetrical models because it allows you to create another, basically the other side of it, without having to do it yourself. The solidify modifier is a bit different than the other modifiers because it doesn't really work as well on a cube or the models that we are using right now, because because what it does is it creates, basically makes the object more solid. So like here you can see it expands it outwards and stuff. Most of the time though, it's better for stuff like clothing, where if I delete all these sides of it, you can see that if I delete all that, I've now got one face, and it's super thin. You can see there's no width to it, no width. It's completely thin, it's invisible. But if I turn this up, you can see that it makes it thicker. And normally it goes backwards, but you can also make it go forwards too if that's what you want by making it negative. What this does is basically creates more geometry, kind of like extruding it backwards, but in a non-destructive way. And this is really useful because you can see it's still looks like the same like flat plane and there isn't any on the backside. But like if I extrude these outwards, now it looks kind of like a really crappy t-shirt model because it's been solidified. And normally it might like wrap around the whole object, and but like it'll have like holes and stuff for everything, like so. Boom. Now it's like a little cup or something. It's also really useful stuff like that. But basically, whenever you have a super thin, basically like an open face, you're gonna want to solidify the inside, so that way it doesn't look like it's super, like like nanometers thin or whatever. The array modifier basically allows you to create multiple duplications of your object. So like if I use the array modifier here, I can turn up the count and it creates a super large amount of my object. Now like I have 20 of them. You can also assign it to keyframes and other stuff to make stuff grow outwards. And you can increase or decrease the distance and like the way they're facing. Like I can make it go upwards, for example. This is really useful if you're making stuff like railway tracks or things like that. Like if I were to make a railway track here or something, where I selected this face and I brought it out here, and then did something like this, and I made something like this for some reason. Basically what this would do is it would make it so that this model right here, this like amazing railway track, if I assign an array to it, I can make it so that it faces up like this, and I can increase the count and it'll repeat forever. Yeah, but basically it allows you to do that. You can also set it to fit length or to fit a curve. When you set it to fit curve, you can create a curve, which is basically like a similar to a like a vertice, but not really, because they basically like if I move this outwards, you can see it creates a smooth curve where like with a vertice it would create very sharp, jagged, basically just like instantly move. But if I set it to fit curve and I set it to this curve, it would basically set it to fit to that. I didn't set it up properly here, but that's kind of how it would work. Finally, we have the skin modifier, which doesn't usually work for objects like this. Yeah, you can see it doesn't really work very well for this. That's because it's mainly used when you want to make a single vertice into a cube for certain reasons. Like if I turn this into a vertice right here, and I give it the skin modifier, it becomes a cube. And with Control A, I can control the scale of it, like so. But scaling it normally doesn't work, you see? But basically, if I take this, I can now extrude it outwards, and I can create something like this. And this is really useful because now, boom, I have this. And I can add a subdivision surface modifier to it if I want to. And what it'll do is it'll make it very smooth like this. And this is super, super good because if you're ever trying to create like an organic like vines or something, you might want to do this because it gives it its own thickness. And you can control the scale of all of them too, basically how thick the lines and everything between them are. This is really useful for if I want to create vines or tree branches or anything like that. This is what people might use for that.